On the evening of July 16, 1999, a single-engine Piper Saratoga disappeared from radar screens over the Atlantic Ocean south of Martha's Vineyard. On board were John F. Kennedy Jr., his wife Carolyn Bessette Kennedy, and her sister Lauren Bessette. All three were killed. In the years since, the public has never stopped being drawn to the story of John and Carolyn, a couple who represented something rare and magnetic in American life. Now, a new limited series on FX is bringing that story back into focus, and with it, details about their relationship that most people never knew. Chief among them is a story involving an anonymous letter, a restaurant confrontation, and a breakup that lasted nearly a year. So what exactly happened, and how close does the television version come to the truth? The FX limited series is called Love Story, John F. Kennedy Jr. and Carolyn Bessette. It stars Paul Anthony Kelly as JFK Jr. and Sarah Pidgeon as Carolyn Bessette, the Calvin Klein associate who would eventually become his wife. The show traces the arc of their relationship from the moment they met through their marriage, and it does not shy away from the difficult chapters along the way. One of those chapters centers on a handwritten letter that arrived without a signature and carried accusations serious enough to stop their romance in its tracks. The show dramatizes this moment, but the real story, according to those who have studied it closely, was considerably more complicated and more painful than what appeared on screen. The series is based on a 2024 book written by author Elizabeth Beller. The book is titled Once Upon a Time, The Captivating Life of Carolyn Bessette Kennedy, and it draws on years of research into a woman who was famously private, rarely gave interviews, and left behind very little in the way of a public record. Beller's work represents one of the more thorough attempts to reconstruct Carolyn's life from the inside out, and when it comes to the anonymous letter, Beller does not treat it as a footnote, she treats it as a turning point. But what precisely did that letter say? According to Beller, the letter arrived early in John and Carolyn's relationship, around 1992. The anonymous author made a series of claims designed to undermine Carolyn in John's eyes. The letter alleged that she was a social climber, that she used people to get what she wanted, that she had a history of questionable relationships, and that her interest in John was driven by ambition rather than genuine feeling. The letter also alleged drug use and painted a picture of a woman whose motives could not be trusted. For someone in John Kennedy's position, those kinds of allegations carried weight. He had grown up surrounded by people who wanted something from the Kennedy name, and he had been trained from an early age to be cautious about exactly that kind of person. So when the letter arrived, he did not dismiss it, he took it seriously. That raises an obvious question. Who sent the letter, and why would someone go to the trouble of writing it anonymously? Beller addresses this directly in her book. She writes that the author of the letter was someone from John's own social circle, a person who came from the world of boarding schools, Ivy League universities, and old-money New York families. The author did not reveal their identity to John at the time, and for years the letter remained anonymous. It was only later, according to Beller, that Carolyn herself figured out who had written it. Once she knew, she cut that person out of her life entirely. Beller describes Carolyn as having frozen them out, a response that suggests the discovery was both confirmation and closure. But before any of that happened, the damage had already been done. The confrontation came at a Manhattan restaurant called El Teddy's. John had read the letter, and rather than give Carolyn the benefit of the doubt or approach the situation with an open conversation, he went into the dinner already having formed a judgment. According to Beller's account, he told Carolyn what the letter said, and then, in an act that left her stunned, he tossed the letter across the table at her, stood up, and walked out. He did not wait for her response. He did not ask for her side of the story. He simply left. Carolyn sat there, read the letter herself, and found the whole thing not only false but insulting. She described it as ridiculous. But beyond the content of the letter, she was rattled by the fact that John had apparently believed it, or at least believed it enough to walk out on her without a real discussion. That reaction from Carolyn raises its own question. Was she simply hurt, or was she done with the relationship entirely? Based on Beller's account, Carolyn was not quick to forgive. John, for his part, recognized almost immediately that he had handled the situation badly. He began calling her, on her personal phone and at work. He sent flowers. He tried repeatedly to reach her and to explain himself. Beller describes it in terms that suggest a sustained effort on John's part, writing that he called and called and kept calling over the course of days. Carolyn did not respond to any of it. She went quiet, and she stayed quiet. The breakup held. The two of them did not reconcile until 1993, meaning roughly a year passed between the El Teddy's confrontation and any real attempt at starting over. That is a significant amount of time, and it says something about how seriously Carolyn took the incident. During that year apart, both of them continued their lives. John returned to his on-again, off-again relationship with actress Daryl Hannah, a pairing that had attracted its share of public attention over the years. He was also linked during this period to model Julie Baker. Carolyn, meanwhile, began dating model Michael Burgeon, a relationship that would later become a source of significant tension when she and John eventually got back together. None of this was unusual for two young, attractive, high-profile people living in New York City in the early 1990s, but it does underscore that the breakup was real, not a brief cooling-off period. Both of them moved on, at least for a time. So how did they find their way back to each other, and was the reconciliation ever truly complete? Beller writes that John eventually found a way to convince Carolyn to try again, though she does not spell out exactly what was said or what changed. What she does make clear is that Carolyn approached the reconciliation with caution. She gave it a chance, but she was guarded. She knew, as Beller puts it, that she was not John's only option. The trust that had been damaged by the letter and by the way he had handled it did not rebuild overnight. The two of them began dating exclusively in early 1994, which means there was a period of gradual re-engagement before anything became official. Their relationship became publicly visible through paparazzi photographs in 1995. By the 4th of July weekend that same year, John had proposed to Carolyn on Martha's Vineyard. They were married on September 21, 1996, in a private ceremony on Cumberland Island off the coast of Georgia. The wedding was so carefully kept from public view that most of the world did not know it had happened until after the fact. For a couple who had spent years being photographed without their consent and dissected in the tabloid press, the secrecy felt entirely intentional. It was one of the few major events of their shared life that they managed to control completely. The FX series dramatizes the anonymous letter episode, but it compresses the timeline and softens the aftermath. In the show, the confrontation and reconciliation happen relatively quickly. John shows up at Carolyn's apartment, apologizes, and they make up. The emotional damage is real, but contained. What Beller's research suggests is that the actual experience was slower and harder, that Carolyn's silence was not just a dramatic beat, but a genuine withdrawal, and that the road back required sustained effort and genuine humility from John. The show is not wrong in its broad strokes, but it smooths over the texture of what those months must have actually felt like. What the story of the anonymous letter ultimately reveals is something that gets lost in the mythology that tends to surround John and Carolyn. They were a genuinely glamorous couple, and their deaths at young ages have given their story a permanent, almost cinematic quality. But the relationship itself was built on ordinary human experiences, miscommunication, wounded pride, jealousy, betrayal by someone in a trusted circle, and the slow work of deciding whether something broken was worth repairing. The fact that someone in John's own social world took the time to write that letter anonymously suggests that not everyone around them wished them well. The fact that Carolyn eventually figured out who wrote it and quietly cut them off suggests she was not a woman who forgot easily. And the fact that they chose each other anyway, got married, and remained together until the end says something about what the relationship became over time, even with all of that weight behind it. The letter was a test neither of them handled perfectly, but they survived it and went on to build a life that, for all its complications, was clearly theirs.